I was ready to put the wings on the airframe, but the bolts that I have are too short to properly mount up the wings with those seaplane lifts on there, the little shackles for the seaplane lifts. So I've ordered new bolts for that. Still waiting for the rivets to come in to assemble that aileron. So that is sitting on the shelf. The paint has dried enough on this flap that I can go ahead and put the fabric on it. I might as well do this while I'm waiting for those other parts to show up. So I cleaned off my workbench, got everything cleaned off of it, and I got some more of this, we call it Echo drop paper, drop cloth, and it's just kind of a craft paper stuff, like a brown paper bag, but it's got a little bit of a waxy, plasticized face on one side, and this is what I used before when I was doing the fabric stuff on the airplane. And it works pretty good to keep stuff from sticking to the table. It's clean, so you don't get any dirt transfer. Even though I washed the bench down and stuff real good, it's still a chance of getting some dirt transfer on there. And then I had to get up overhead and dig my box out of my fabric. I looked through all the fabric looking to see if some of the scraps I had, if I had any scraps big enough to do this flap with. And while I've got pieces of fabric that are big enough that I could do the flap in pieces, in say 2 pieces, I don't really want to do that. And I do have fabric here that I can do it properly all in one piece. So I put the flap up here and laid some fabric out, made a line there so I can wrap that flap with it, mark my line. And I've just coated it with some poly brush to make that line easier to cut so it doesn't fray. So I'll wait for that poly brush to set up and then come back, cut that line, and start working on covering that flap. I got my fabric cut out. I had a little bit of dirt in there and some spots on it where it was grabbed or folded or something. I don't know why it was there. Well, I got some acetone and a rag out and washed that down. Well, this one seam that I made on here, I coated last night with a poly brush, real thin poly brush. You know, that just zips right up and leaves no burrs or anything else. The other end that was cut here raw, of course, it's got all kinds of fraying on it. So this is definitely the way to go to keep it from fraying. Got my anti-chafe tape on there. Covered up all the rivets, pretty much the way it was when I took it apart. All the rivets that go around here on this leading edge where it attaches to this spar, and then the screws down here where this trailing edge attaches. All of that is covered up. That's pretty much the way it was with masking tape when I took it apart. I had all that trouble with that masking tape getting it off there, and seen nothing but trouble with the masking tape underneath that fabric where it gets put on. I use this anti-chafing tape. This is the approved, authorized anti-chafing tape for polyfiber. And it's very much like the old adhesive tape that we used to use before they come out with plastic everything for bandages and stuff. Also very much like the tape that they used for taping up injuries, ankles and wrists and things like that in sporting when I was in high school. It's a woven fabric tape. It's got adhesive on one side. The adhesive is not very strong on it, so it's easy to come off there. It's not near as tacky as masking tape is or duct tape. Oh, and it unravels on the edges, so you get strings on it. You got to watch out for that. But it's supposed to be just the thing for putting in underneath that fabric. It's a lot better than the masking tape. Had nothing but trouble with the masking tape where it's gone on there, either getting it off or having corrosion and stuff underneath it. It absorbs a lot of moisture, and I got this stuff to use on the fuselage, particularly around the mounting bracket for the strakes on the tail. Anyway, I've already used more of it on this than I used on the whole fuselage. So the next thing to do now is to dig out some polytack and put some polytack on this trailing edge. You just need an inch of overlap of the fabric on a seam, and so there's plenty of room here. There's about an inch here between the bottom of these screws where they're covered up with this anti-chafing tape and the trailing edge, and then of course I can always wrap it around there and put my first seam like that. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to glue this down to the trailing edge, wrap it over the leading edge, and that's what they recommend in the polyfiber manual. So the fabric is on. Kind of looks kind of crappy, but it's on. It should turn out a lot better once it's shrunk down. The other cover on it, they wrapped around the tail and had the seam up on the leading edge, and I did it the opposite direction. I put the seam down on the trailing edge instead, and then they trimmed it up flush with the end ribs on both ends and put a cap over it. Well, I extended that fabric out over the ends and folded them over, so there's a double fold over the ends there. Well, it's kind of a mess right now. I need to get the iron and straighten that all out and everything and flatten it all out and clean it up. But I got to wait till the glue finish setting on those pockets. Those pockets for the hinges are kind of a challenge to get in there to get that glue on the inside of that. I turned all those edges over and wrapped them around the leading edge and into those pockets. And anyway, they don't want to stick very bad. I've got these little plastic clamps that I got that holding them down until the polytack sets up. This is just the last little bit here. Well, as usual, I'm surprised. That tightened up pretty doggone tight. As loose as that was on there, that come out pretty doggone tight. Before I put polybrush on there, I have to wash it down with acetone, make sure and get all of the oils and greases and everything else off of there. So I got my layout on here on this flap for the rib stitches. I wanted about 1.5 inches apart. They've got to be about 1 3/4 inches. Took a rule on there and did some figuring on it, and by laying it out, I figured that if I came 3/4 of an inch up above this trailing edge, then that would give me my most uniform layout, symmetrical layout. There's little tabs that come back off of this spar here onto each one of these ribs, and so you can't put a stitch up that far. Then they've got these Y ribs here that have a plate comes way back on them, and that puts it just about 1/4 inch back from that, 3/8 of an inch on that, and 1/4 inch on these. What they recommend in the polyfiber manual is you can take a chalk line and snap a chalk line on there. So I just got a builder's chalk line and snapped a chalk line on that top surface. So that gives me my marks anyway where all my rib stitches are going to go. Well, now I can get my tape. There's a little piece of tape that goes on here, doubler underneath the rib stitching. I can put that on there, then start punching the holes and start tying the stitching. I got the rib lacing all done. It looks pretty good. I made a mistake yesterday when I put the polybrush on there. I dumped the polybrush out of the container into my little cup there to put it on. I didn't run it through a screen, and it had some crap in it, and it got on here, just little dibbles and dabs and stuff on here. So anyway, after I got all done, you got a little bit of wax that builds up in these holes around this string and stuff from pulling the string through and tying the knots. So I went over it with a little bit of acetone and wiped it down to get the wax off of there, and that kind of smeared some of the polybrush and some of this powder from the chalk line in. And well, anyway, I went ahead and went over the whole thing with a little bit of reducer just to smooth it out and get the crap off of there. I took my polybrush and run it through a screen so I won't have that problem again. So now I can lay out the finishing tapes and try to figure out how to do that. I almost forgot about putting drain holes in here. Well, I got to looking at the old flap cover, and they only had 2 drain holes in. They had one here, I think, and one down here on this side, right close to these ribs. Well, that must have been enough because there was no corrosion in the flap, and the only corrosion that I found was on the spar of that aileron, but that was just because of dissimilar metal corrosion there between the steel hinges and the aluminum spar. But I don't think that was right anyway, and I did a lot more than that on the tail surfaces when I covered those. I think ideally I'd put one in here right next to each one of these ribs on each side, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to put one in the middle of each one of these bays here, and instead of just putting a hole in it, I'm going to go ahead and put some of these seaplane grommets on there like I did with the fuselage and the tail surfaces. Now these theoretically will create a little bit of a venturi effect as you're flying. Air going over these will cause a little bit of suction in here and help pull any moisture out of there. I suppose ideally these would have a hole down in the bottom of them here in this trailing edge, but they didn't have that in them. So anyway, this is what I'm going to do. I got my soldering iron here, and I'm going to go ahead and just burn holes in there. I marked the middle of each one of these bays, put a pretty good sized drain hole in each one of these. I'll go ahead and do that with the rest of these, and then I'll take some polytack and glue these seaplane grommets over those holes. So they can, well, we're making a little bit of progress here. It's going slow, but it is progress. This is taking a lot longer than I remembered it should or would. Well, I got all the finishing tapes on, all the ribs, the main ribs and the nose ribs. Got around the bays here for the hinges. I got little doilies over my vents. Everything's all done now. I need to put something on the trailing edge and then do the edges there around the butt ribs. There's actually a lot to this little thing. I didn't think it'd be that much, but there's actually quite a bit to it. But I've only got one to do, so before where I was doing the tail feathers, I'd do something on one and then I could put it up out of the way and then work on another one. Well, that one dried. This one here, once I do something, I've just got to let it sit while the glue sets up on it. Guess I'm not in a hurry. I ordered those rivets to put that aileron back together about 3 weeks ago, and I kept checking the post office expecting that to be here any time, and it wasn't here. Finally called them yesterday, and they had one rivet or something that was on back order, and they were holding the whole order for that. So I got them to ship that, so that should be here in a few days. And it's the same thing with the bolts for the wing attach. They were sitting on that. They had 1 or 2 bolts that were missing, and they were waiting for a whole thing to get there to ship it. But I got them to ship that stuff. It's in the mail now, so I should be getting those parts here pretty soon. That'll be fine. I'll be done with this then. That flap is all covered. Went over it all with all the tapes and everything with the iron. Everything's all ironed down and it's ready to be sprayed with poly spray. But there's no point in doing that until I get the flap done. And once I get both of them covered, then I can do all the spraying on them.